The subject is the topic being discussed, analyzed, critiqued. It's what the book is about. And it applies solely, it applies to nonfiction. And we can talk about, we could talk about, yeah, there's some fiction, your fictional book might be about something. But nonfiction gets subject. Nonfiction does not get genre. So genre, what is it? Here I am talking all about it. We've never defined it. A genre is a category of works which share a similar theme, setting, plot, characters, tone, atmosphere, keep going, tropes, motifs, etc. That is, the genre is the content. It's not what the book's about, it's what the book is. And it's independent of the form or format. So a graphic novel can be in any genre. Poetry can be in any genre. And it applies to fiction. It only applies to fiction. It does not apply to nonfiction. Nonfiction has form. So, having said all that, what are the genres? There's no formal or official list of genres. We could spend the rest of the day listing genres or not. We spend enough. New genres are constantly being created, and they're created because somebody writes them. They're not created because there's some board that sits around and says, oh, we need a new genre, let's do this. People start writing this, it starts being recognized as a genre, or what we'll get into, hybrid or something. It starts being used. Existing genres disappear. They disappear because nobody writes them anymore. So you could bring a genre back by just starting to write in it again, but there's no formal official list. There's no body that creates these definitions. There's no formal definitions. There's no body creating the list. There's nobody creating the definitions. However, associations and organizations may have their own. If you're writing for the Romance Writers of America and you want to enter their contest, you had better follow their definition of the genre. Same with mysteries, sci-fi, all the different genres. So it's not that there's nothing out there, it's that there's no genre police. Except so you can self-publish, or you can probably even find a publisher who will publish that romance for you and call it a romance, and that's just fine. But you can't enter it in the RWA contest. It didn't meet that specification. The boundaries are fuzzy. You can look at the core. We can probably figure out, okay, this is the core, this is the center, this is what it absolutely is. And then we start getting farther from that core, and it starts getting looser and looser and fuzzier and fuzzier. And what we find, two things. One is all books fit into more than one genre. Because of that, because the boundaries are fuzzy, so they aren't, well, think of any book and you will see that, okay, it's a Western, but there's a romance in it. Or it's a romance and it took place in the West. And those are slightly different, but you could put it either place. My work is historical, cozy, culinary mystery set in the West. I mean, I have made up my own. Because there are all these aspects of it. You can have science fiction that's a mystery. Isaac Asimov wrote a lot of those. So they have the aspects of more than one genre, partly because of that. But also, those fuzzy boundaries are where these new genres get created, because people start writing things that are fitting there. So the question, and don't wait. Yeah, okay. So the question we're starting with is, can you define a genre any way you want? And the answer is yes. As I said, there's no body out there going to stop you. The real question is, should you? And I think we'll sort of come back to this at the end of the presentation and see what the answer is. So what are the genres? Realistic fiction. I started with, basically we divide it into, there are a couple of ways to divide it, but this way that I'm doing today is realistic versus speculative. Those are two big categories. And then within those categories, we break it down, remembering always that boundaries are fuzzy. So realistic fiction breaks down into contemporary. Stop. Contemporary is set in the time period in which it is written. Up to about 50 years. There's real, yeah, and that's, I think of contemporary as within the living memory of the author. So works written 60 years ago are not historical fiction. If they were set 60 years ago, written 60 years ago, they are contemporary fiction. They're written by people who were living there, written by people who have firsthand knowledge of that time and place. And that does not change just because the work gets older. The reader changes, but the book itself doesn't. So it's realistic. No magical or supernatural elements. You can.
So after 50 years, your book is historic fiction?
No, it is not.
Okay, I'm getting confused.
Well, when I get the next one, I think it'll be clear. I think it's, but there's no magical or supernatural elements. You can kind of suggest that maybe it was a ghost, but really it was an air balloon, but it's got to be realistic, and technology is accurate to the time in which it is written. So there's no speculation about future technology. The other type of realistic is historical. And historical is set 50 years before the time period in which it is written. So no, contemporary never becomes historical. It was written at that time by people living at that time. You don't have to do research to write contemporary fiction. And I don't want to get too far off into that. This is like my pet thing. The reason is you can make mistakes in contemporary fiction, but you're unlikely to make anything, you're unlikely to. You know what people are eating, you know what they're reading, you know what they're driving. You're writing the stuff you have experience with every day. Your experience is going to be different from somebody else's. But you're not, when I read a Western set in the 19th century and they go on a date, I'm just like, that's it, I'm done. You didn't date in the 19th century. It just did not happen. You went out with groups of kids, but you did not, the two of you, go out to dinner until you were formally engaged. You didn't go on a buggy ride. So that's a mistake we make because we apply our contemporary ideas. We don't even think about it. But you won't do that in your contemporary because you know what's going on. Yes.
But we say that contemporary is within the lifetime of the author?
Written.
So contemporary is something that is written within the lifespan of the
author. That's what I'm saying, living memory. The author's living memory, yeah.
Okay.
But it always stays contemporary. Okay. The author has been dead 100 years. It's still contemporary to the author, to the time period. And it's going to be more or less accurate than historical. And it's the inaccuracies are going to be because your experience was different from someone else's. So it's not inaccurate, it's just different. So historical fiction, 50 years or more. And there are two things, and somebody actually brought something up earlier about this, and I thought, oh, there's a good one. Now I've forgotten it. Some people will say 20 years. Historical Writers of America, whatever the name is, Historical Novel Society says 50 years. Again, if you're going to write for them, it's got to be 50 years. Other people say 20 because that's a generation. I personally think it depends on how old the author is, but you can't do that. You've got to have, you can, because it's, if the author is 20 and they're writing about something 21 years ago, they don't have any memory of it. So to me, that's historical, but you can't do that in a genre and just say, we need your birthday before we can tell you your genre. So historical fiction versus fictionalized history. Oh, that's right. This came up on Substack. So historical fiction is fiction, fictional characters set in an historical time period. So there may be events, there may be characters who were real. They don't have to be. It's going to be hard to do it, at least without being events. But if you write something set in the Civil War, you do not have to introduce Abe Lincoln into it. He doesn't have to make an appearance. You set this, so you've got the war going on, you've got the clothing, you've got all, but it's the story is fictional, the main characters are fictional. Fictionalized history is not history. And it is absolutely fine until people start thinking it's history. Fictionalized history uses real characters and real events, but it fictionalizes them. They have conversations nobody could possibly have known about. They have thoughts that are not recorded in a diary, or they may combine a couple of characters. The way they do in movies, so we've got one character, but he really combines three or four, or she does. Fictionalized history, again, is fine if you make clear this is fiction. These characters have been dead long enough, I'm afraid they have no rights. So nobody can sue you about it. And so you can have Abraham Lincoln show up at somebody's birthday party. Just make sure that people understand he didn't actually do that. That this is just in my book. So that's the one thing with fictionalized history. And too often it gets presented as real history. And then people get misinterpretations, misimpressions. They think somebody said something which they didn't say. The one I read, all of it, was Antonia Fraser, and a lot of her stuff is fictionalized. And I, for years, thought, oh no, that's what they said, and then found out no, they didn't say that. So and the library had classed it in biography, which it shouldn't have been. But anyway, so these are the differences. The two main genres of realistic fiction, contemporary, historical, and of course we have all of the hybrids, but we'll talk about those later. So the primary, yes. Mm-hmm.
So it would be fictionalized history if I surmise that so and so and so historical figures had a conversation, but there's no proof that they had that conversation. I'm making that part up.
Yes.
That's just
well, they might even have had a conversation. You might know that the two men met at a conference, but you make up what they said to each other, and you can still be making it up based on historical record.
There's just no direct proof that
that they said those things in those words to each other. Yes, and that can be very effective, especially as an author. If you're saying, I took his speech. I saw some Martin Luther King yesterday. I took his letter from a Birmingham jail, and I took these ideas from it, and I had him say them to Malcolm X. We know the men met. We don't know what they talked about. But if they had, they would have said things like this based on their writings. And that's very, actually do that a lot in kids' biographies. But just making clear that this is my idea of what they would have said. And I do that in mine. I have a couple of real people show up very briefly. I have an author's note. I have an author's note that this person actually was in that role. Of course, she never spoke to my fictional character. So just keeping it clear for everyone, yes.
What you're talking about is wonderful because it's exactly what I did in my book. I had the real instances and even real conversations from my great grandmother But then a lot of the things that I discovered when I've been researching, I couldn't believe that this was what was happening or this was the way people felt then. And I had to add that too.
Yeah. Yeah.
All this history is in there, but it's fiction.
Yes. Yes. Did I see? Yes.
Yeah, there's a play called Nixon and Kissinger,
Yes.
and it's about, we know that they had a meeting the day before Nixon resigned on TV, but it wasn't recorded, and the author just gave his interpretation of what he thinks probably happened.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it can be really interesting, and it can lead people to say, well, I want to know more about these guys. And especially, as I say, for something like that, I would include an author's note and say, I use these sources. You can go back to the sources, you can read them. But just understanding that you will not ever find this conversation as it was. So these are our primary realistic fiction genres. So let you read them. But they could be contemporary, they could be historical. Absolutely can write contemporary Western fiction. I know people don't think of it that way. They always think it's 19th century. But if there is contemporary Western fiction right now, what's his name? McMurtry, Longmire. Who wrote Longmire? Craig Johnson. That's all contemporary. I read a lot of mysteries, so so it can be contemporary or historical. And so you can see all of these genres are fitting into that larger category. Okay. So we talked about realistic. The other type is big category, speculative. Not realistic. I should not have said non. I should say not realistic. The first that we're familiar with, well, we're familiar, but fantasy. Now, what characterizes fantasy is magical or supernatural or unnatural elements. And it breaks down into high fantasy or heroic fantasy. Those are two names, and there's probably a couple others floating around now. Those are set in an alternate world that has different rules from ours. The low fantasy is set in our world. Now, it can be contemporary, it can be historical, but it's in our physical world with our physical rules, and that's how you know it's magic, because they're violating the rules, but the rules are still there. And then low fantasy breaks down into supernatural and horror. And horror is supernatural, except that it's fear-based. So someone who wants to if you want to call it supernatural fantasy, that's going to be maybe spooky, might have ghosts, but once you get over into, the demons that are eating your face, you're into horror. And people who don't want that, don't want to be told they picked up a supernatural fantasy and there's demons eating their face. You could even have actually the characters in the horror in your supernatural fantasy if they were not violent and terrifying. So the real aspect there is the fear, and then it's got humans. Again, it's low fantasy. You're going to have humans and they're interacting with these. Supernatural is, again, humans encountering the supernatural for the first time, generally. The other type of speculative is science fiction. And the first thing with that is it's set in the future. Although I'm going to have to backtrack on that because it could be set in the past if you're doing steampunk. But in general, science fiction is set in the future. They have, instead of magic and fantastical characters, they have futuristic technology, which you don't know how it works any better than you know magic, and fantastical characters that they call aliens. So there's sci-fi and fantasy crossover in so many different, those boundaries just merge. However, with science fiction, your focus is on the technological advances or changes in culture and society, whereas fantasy is on magic, and it may just not even be our society. So high fantasy is this. I've just got a whole list. This is an example also of how complex your genres can be. You might just stick with, I'm writing heroic fantasy, and not try to break it down into any of these different sorts of, and this is where a lot grows. New feminist heroic fantasy was not around 50 years ago. Well, that's probably when it got its start, because it was Mary Stuart. And then low fantasy are these types of things. So low fantasy encompasses children. Talking animals, that's low fantasy, unless you're talking animals in an alternate world. And we could go on forever. You can have enchanted journeys in both, but in this one, the enchanted journey is through our world. Poi fantasy, again, toys that talk, toys that sometimes we call these fairy tales. Indigenous magical realism, urban fantasy, which may be pretty dark, but it's taking place in cities of this world. Science fiction breaks down into hard sci-fi, which is really focused on technology and may have a lot of detailed, Michael Crichton did this hard sci-fi, and he had a lot of detailed scientific information in there on which he was basing his speculations. So the idea Jurassic Park, we got a fly or a mosquito trapped in amber that had blood, that had, the chances of that actually happening are pretty slim. But if you did, you could do these things. And that's where people feel that science fiction and diverges from fantasy, because it's an if you could, you could. It's following scientific principles. It's not very realistic, because the DNA would have degraded by now. But if it didn't, you could do this. Those include things, these type of subgenres. Your futuristic adventure, dystopian and post-apocalyptic, urban, it would be a city in the future, and then techno. And you can also have, like I said, well, and then soft, hard and soft. You probably saw that coming. Should be one more line there. There it is. So soft sci-fi is less focused on technology and more focused on the cultural, social, political implications. I remember when I was first reading it, the difference between Ray Bradbury and Arthur C. Clarke. Asimov's kind of there in the middle, especially with his Foundation trilogy. I, Robot is a little more, but still, but which one, Bradbury's science didn't work very well, but it was soft sci-fi. And then you could have actually any of the ones I've listed above could be soft. It's all about, are you looking at the technology primarily, or are you looking at how society has changed? And then we have, hybrid genres, and these are coming out all the time. I just put down ones I could think of. I know there are a lot more of them, and they probably, some of these are no longer here. But I'm seeing cozy mystery with fantasy. There are cozy mysteries that feature witches. Lots of them, quite frankly. Or talking cats, which I wish. Fractured fairy tales are actually a hybrid. They're a fairy tale and satire. So that's a blend. Romantasy, that's the big one. Although there's a discussion about whether that's fantasy romance or romantic fantasy. And some people say I write fantasy romance. So it's a romance, focus on the romance in a fantasy setting. And others say I write romantic fantasy. It's a fantasy with a romance in it. And those specifically will include a human alien. But, people argue, whatever. Science fantasy, and the two I thought of immediately, science and magic is Witch World. I may be the only one who still remembers Andre Norton. And Dragon Riders of Pern, Anne McCaffrey actually gives a scientific explanation for how they bred these dragons from little lizards. So there's a scientific explanation for telepathic dragons that breathe fire. So that would be a science fantasy where they have psionic powers. What we call, sword and sorcery, which is probably back, that's a high fantasy. They have things called sword and planet. That's like Conan the Barbarian. It's a sword, but it's a different planet, so it's sci-fi, it's science fantasy. Time travel falls under that. Until somebody builds an actual working time machine and can explain how it works, it's fantasy. And then Western fantasy or horror, I was thinking of Stephen King's Dark Tower on that one. But I'm sure there are others. You can pretty much combine any two. And there was a time I would have said you can't combine contemporary and historical. And then I saw a question on one of my things just this morning where she said, I write these stories where it starts out contemporary, but then it becomes historical. And I was like, how do you do that? And so, well, it's not a portal thing, because if you've got the portal, you got fantasy, you're done. It's more finding a diary and beginning to read this diary, and then sort of the story, the person is still, the story moves then to the person who wrote the diary. So they don't move the contemporary character to the past, but as the starts reading it, they shift the focus, the POV becomes the person in the diary. So I'm even seeing you can combine those. But any of these also can be contemporary, they can be historical, they can be futuristic. So it's science fantasy. So here we are at the end, rush through it so we'd have time. So this is where we started. There's no formal official list of genres. There's no formal official definition of genres outside of certain organizations. Genre boundaries are fuzzy. So for the first question, we're going to take a few minutes, I hope. How do you decide what genre your work is? We decided at the beginning that this is important. You want to reach the right readers. And you do not want to reach the wrong readers. Because you get somebody reading your book and it's not what they wanted, you're going to get the negative reviews, you're going to get the bad word of mouth. So you want to, with romance, if you say there's no steam, there had better not be any steam. You just said there's no graphic sex, it better not be any. And that's actually getting broken down now. I'm seeing it where it's sweet, closed door, which I may be the only one who watches Fisk. There's a comedy coming out of Australia, and the two older gentlemen are writing the story of their romance, and the father once asked the daughter, is that too graphic? She's like, what? And we closed the door. Why would that be? We closed the door. because of course adults know exactly what that means, but no, it's not graphic. How do you decide? This is a question for discussion.
I think if you have, a book with mixed topics, you would pick the one that is the biggest, the more overall scheme, where the other one just comes in periodically. That would be secondary. That's what I think.
Yeah. So the primary focus of your work?
Yeah.
And yes, in most cases. But and that's not a but. Another thing to look at is when is it set? So you're going to take those big three. You're going to say, is it contemporary or historical? Is it fantasy or sci-fi? And then, so it's science fiction. Is it soft or hard? Now, but yes, looking at what's the primary focus of the work. You also want to look at where it's set. People who want to read historical want to read historical. And they may read historical romance, they may read historical Western, they may read, if you say it's a Western and you don't have cows and horses, you need to think about that, Am I really a Western? Is this what people who read Westerns expect? They're absolutely fine with contemporary Westerns. You can drive a pickup truck, but you better be driving it out on the range to round up your cattle. Or you can be Longmire, who has a horse, actually, now I think about it. So the primary focus, anything else?
You could see what the most similar authors to you are. So you probably already know that if you're writing a certain kind of book, and then go on Amazon and see how they're tagged as the genre that they're in through the Kindle service. And that's how those people are being recommended. If you like this book, you'll like these books. And so
right. Amazon doesn't actually work like that. We wish it did. They lie. But yes, I would say go to a bookstore. See where BISAC has put it. Oh gosh, BISAC, what does it stand for? The bookstores use categories and they're actually printed on the back of the book. The problem with Amazon is Amazon's telling you what people bought who bought your book. So the book that's similar to yours, and then you're seeing these other books. In my case, for years and years, you got a whole list of children's books because I bought birthday and Christmas presents for children. And then I would buy a book for myself, and anybody who bought that book was said, "You'll like these." And why would I like those? So you can use Amazon, but just be careful and be aware that it's not necessarily accurate. So you might want to look at those other books they're saying are similar to yours and see if they actually are, or is it just that there are people out there who like to read in both genres and are buying them. But the bookstore is going to be, or public library.
I would think that if you found a book that is almost all historic, but in the middle of it, they find a valley that's full of dinosaurs, you better mention it.
Yes.
Because historic fiction readers like accurate history.
Yes, exactly. So it might actually be a small part of your book, but it's moved it from realistic to speculative.
I was having trouble figuring out the genre for my novel. And my editor said it's magical realism, and I realized that's what it is, although I had no intention. I mean, I don't read that, but she said that it was it's a literary fiction book, and that's its subgenre of literary fiction, whereas I thought it was more of a paranormal book, and she said that's more of a pop. So I think that is what it is. I just
Well, and that's a good question because literary fiction is a form. That the question as to whether is it magical realism or paranormal, is not whether it's literary or genre fiction. It's how it's being handled. Magical realism is fantasy. The rules of this world do not apply. Things just morph into other things. You are walking down the road and you're suddenly in the past, or you cross a river and everything is different. Whereas paranormal tends to be more, we're right here and a ghost comes in. So our world is, and then this thing sort of enters it or changes it. Whereas magical realism, it looks realistic and then it's just not. And my book is Fried Chicken Castañeda because it's set at the Castañeda Hotel in Las Vegas. But when I do book signings, I get people asking me, is that about Carlos? And I had the first time somebody says, is that about Carlos? And I was like, oh, right. Took me way back to my undergrad years when I read him. No.
We have a question
Uh-huh.
online saying, how would you classify a short story collection as to genre?
Unless they're all one genre, you don't.
That's a good question.
You have to call it short stories. If they're all like Asimov's is sci-fi, except that he wrote those ones that were mysteries and he wrote the ones that were paranormal. So those got classified that way. If your short stories are kind of all over the place, I would just leave it at short story. Unless there's something you really want to, and then in your blurb, you're going to talk about this includes paranormal stories and these stories and those stories, but otherwise people know they're getting a mixture. Yeah. Yes.
I'm just gonna say that when I was teaching science fiction, mystery science fiction and supernatural in a high school, it's all happening now. So if, I don't know what people that are writing along that on genre now are printing, because I haven't read a lot of it at this point, but I wondered. And the other thing I wanted to say is that when my first book first came out, I looked at small bookstores. They did not exist. All over New Mexico, all
Yep.
over California, all over Florida, even in the Northeast. Some of them had just disappeared. They'd be
Right.
online and you'd look for them, but they weren't there.
Yeah.
So, we can be very careful because it looks like Barnes and Noble in a lot of areas is the only bookstore left.
Mhm.
So.
Yeah. But and I didn't mean that it's not a good idea to compare your book to similar books and see where they are. Just be careful. Well, in the public library, they tend not to organize the books by genre for many of the reasons we've been talking about. The boundaries are fuzzy, there is no form, but they will have stickers. And so, and the paperbacks tend to be organized by genre. And so you can see that. And if Amazon's right, that people who are reading this book are reading those books, it
That's
probably
not
doesn't.
what I was saying.
But that's how Amazon
Right, what I
gives
was
you
saying
the.
is that when I, as an author, put a book into Kindle, I have to tag it by
Yeah.
genre. And if you can get in and see how people who knew what they were doing tagged their books, then it can give you a hint. That might be helpful. That's all I meant. I didn't
Right,
mean like-
you're making an assumption that they knew what they were doing.
Well, I guess I know that.
So actually, under book details on
Right.
Kindle in Amazon, it tells you which tags. the
Well, do you
book-
know my tags have changed 3 times?
Well, they do.
Yeah.
They are fluid,
Yeah,
but it's based on the different bestseller lists
right.
that they use. And so they're very specific. Friends to Lovers Romance, Regency Historical Romance. They give you very specific hashtags for each of those.
And you can certainly do that. None of the ones that have been assigned to mine are right. So I'm just saying, it's a good place to start. It gives you ideas, but you need to know your own book and you need to know the genres and decide, does it actually fit in there? Mine is showing up right now as World War I fiction. It has absolutely, in fact, it's not even set during World War I, it's set in 1929. So what's happening is people who read the historical World War I stuff are buying mine. So mine has now been tagged
In that.
in that, and that's what I'm saying. That's the algorithm they're using, is looking at what else is being bought by people buying this. And it's going to be more or less accurate. So knowing your own book, knowing the genres, you can look at that and say, the romance thing, yeah, that's right on. I would use that, and not for mine, but you might look at that and say, yes, mine's a Regency romance. I'll bet you knew that already. But look at it, it's not a war related work. Just because it's in that time period, it has nothing to do with it. So looking at the primary focus of your work, but also, looking at, is it realistic? Is it speculative? And that's maybe not the focus of the work, but it is where it is set, how it is set. Is it historical? Is it contemporary? And once you got those two big things decided, then looking down through, and would this be, would I put it there? Would I put it there? Have I created a new genre?
So, quick question for you that leads to what you were saying here, or for this next one. The question is, my unpublished novel is set in the present day, but the main character unknowingly takes an action that alters her current reality in a slightly supernatural way. The new reality is still current day, but with things that have supposedly happened to her that she doesn't remember. How do you classify this genre?
Fantasy. I would put it in fantasy, and then I'd have to look at, do I want to break that down farther? It's not just that it's set in the current world, because she's done something supernatural. Well, now it's supernatural. If she had done something with some kind of time travel machine, it could be science fiction. But contemporary, they said way back, it's all realistic. Contemporary realistic. That's why we call it that. There is no paranormal. There is no futuristic stuff. It's what's happening today. So can you define a genre any way you like? Not may you, but can you?
Sure.
Yes, you can. You can decide, this is my genre. This is what I am calling it. This is what I think it should be. But should you? Are your readers going to recognize it? Maybe they will. I mean, I think romantasy is really recognizable personally.
But if you're creating a new genre.
Yeah, if you create something entirely new, will readers recognize it? Will they be drawn to your work because they have no clue what it is you've written? I think you need to ask that question. If you're writing in a certain genre and you know the world of that genre, and you know what people are reading, and you know what people are talking about, you might be able to do it. Because you see these key words floating around in the discussion things, and you say, okay, people know what that is. We're getting right now people calling it cozy adjacent. I call mine cozy adjacent, and I'm like,
I don't even understand that.
I know, it's cozy mystery with sex. I'm like, it's yeah. Okay, yeah, you're almost comfortable, but not quite. Yeah, but so that's something. And if you decide you should, then the question would be, how would you go about it? And how would you go about getting it out there so that people know? Frankly, I am nowhere near well known enough to get away with it. You got to be Stephen King to do that. But you could, like I said, you could look at what's out there, what's being written, how it's being described, what people are talking about in that world. And you could look at your work and say, I really think this is something, it's in this area, it's in this fuzzy boundary, it's between 2 or 3, which would lead us to the final question, and that's a new hybrid genre. And frankly, if I were to try something like that, that's where I would be going. because people understand the terms you're using. So romantic fantasy. We know what romance is, we know what fantasy is. Okay, I can pretty much figure out what that is. It became a genre because lots and lots of people were writing it. Started with Twilight. It really started way back at the beginning, but contemporarily, it started with Twilight. The romance was a fantasy. You had vampires who twinkle. That was a fantasy. And it was all about the romance between these two. So what I want to end with, because we've gone on this, is to just don't get too hung up on genre. It matters. But getting down to that precise pinpoint may do you more harm than good. You're going to eliminate certain people. You're going to offend other people because you got the wrong one. Don't ignore it, but maybe stay with the primary genres. And when you become the New York Times bestseller and people start writing like you're writing, you then can form a new genre. But in the meantime, know what they are and how they apply to your work. But don't obsess over getting exactly the right combination of things. Get the bigger picture, and that will also reach the larger group of people. Thank you so much, Suzanne.